Good evening. I love it when the clocks differ, but at any rate, it's ahead of time over there, or a little late. I'm happy to see you here, and I really am happy because I wasn't sure the term comprehensive plan was enough to draw you on a Monday night. So thank you all, for coming, and I think you will find it a very rewarding program. The comprehensive plan is a land use plan that guides how Seattle will grow in the next 20 years. State law requires that it be updated every 10 years. So this October, Seattle will release its draft plan, and we have a promise from the city's engagement coordinator that she will bring people here in October sometime, hopefully, and we'll have a chance to find out about the draft plan and find out how we can be involved, because there's a very, very important role for the public in discussing and shaping the plan. The date, though, that this all has to be completed for Seattle is the end of next year. So City Council has to approve it all and have the legislation in place by December of 2024. Tonight, we're going to hear about the state requirements and the goals for the comprehensive plan, as well as the need for community engagement. Cynthia Stewart, our speaker, has over 30 years of experience working with local government in both management and consulting capacities. In all of her positions, growth management has been a focal point. She currently serves as a volunteer lobbyist for the League of Women Voters of Washington on an amazing number of issues: housing and homelessness, revenue, transportation, and growth management. She's amazing. At any rate, her slide presentation will take about 20 minutes, and then we have time for questions. Susan Underwood and Jean Durning, where's Jean, have microphones. But I think what we want to do is have the presentation first and then the questions, and you'll be happy to respond. So great to introduce you. Welcome to Cynthia.
Wow, I didn't see you all come in. This is a much bigger group than I thought. So thank you very much for being interested enough to be here. I think that Laura just told you part of what I'm going to talk about, but I might give a little bit more details, and hopefully will inspire you to actually get engaged. Some of this is what I call 101. So those of you who've been involved in these kinds of issues may find it rather boring. And then some of it is a little more detailed. Some of it is oriented towards people all over the state, and then I have a little bit here about Seattle. So we'll see how this goes. And please do ask questions when I get to the end. I'm afraid it might take a little more than 20 minutes, so we'll see how this goes. So the question is, why are we talking about comprehensive planning right now? There are a whole bunch of reasons. One of the big ones right now is that homelessness has to be addressed. You're all familiar with the homelessness problem. It's pretty prominent in downtown Seattle. It's prominent in some of the neighborhoods, and it's prominent in every city in the state of Washington. Even the towns have homelessness. So even a little town like Ording in Pierce County has homelessness. The Key Peninsula outside Gig Harbor, you would just be surprised how much there is. But also, we have climate change. Climate change is making a huge difference, as you know, from the wildfires and the floods and the drought and all the things that we're experiencing now, and we know it's going to get worse. And then finally, we do comprehensive planning, and I'll talk a little bit about the origin of it, but we do it in order to forecast the population that would be here in the next 20 years and make sure that our systems and our infrastructure is adequate to support that population growth. So the homelessness and the climate change have really made it a lot more complicated than it used to be back in the old days. So right now, it's critical because we have to plan for the next 20 years, and we have to have housing figured out for the next 20 years. And this plan update will last 10 years. And that is a change that got made just recently. It used to be a much shorter update period, but in exchange for adding this more complex material, they extended the review period. So what happens is, if we don't get it right now, we can't fix it for 10 more years. And believe me, the planners won't want to do it any sooner. So just to put that in perspective, the Puget Sound area, the Snohomish, King, Pierce, and Kitsap counties are required to have theirs done by the end of 2024. And so the other counties have different timelines, ranging all the way up to 2027 for some of the more rural counties in eastern Washington and on the coast. But between 2024 and 2025, most of western Washington will have to have their comprehensive plans completed. So the requirement to do this comes from the Growth Management Act, and that was an act that was passed back in 1990. The League of Women Voters, I'm proud to say, was one of the organizations that got it passed and got it through the legislature from the very beginning. And we have supported it and most changes to it ever since. The intention was to make sure that we didn't have indefinite sprawl and that we could have a boundary and preserve the rural areas for farming, agriculture, other agriculture, forestry, and resource lands, and keep the urban area more intact and provide infrastructure within the urban area, making it less expensive and more efficient. So that's where it came from, and at the time it was passed, there were 13 goals. There is now another one that I'll talk about in a minute. So the urban growth, the intention to keep growth in the urban area, reducing the sprawl, to have efficient transportation systems and ones that are paid for by the time that they're needed, to have housing, economic development, property rights, permitting, natural resources industries, open space and recreation, and environment. So those are the kinds of things that the legislature intended to have addressed in comprehensive plans through the state requirements ever since 1990. There's also a goal to have adequate citizen participation and coordination, and to make sure that public services that are necessary to support the development are actually provided and paid for by the time they're needed. And then historic preservation is another important goal, so that none of this would override the need to preserve our historic areas. So out of all those goals come 8 mandatory elements that have been there since the beginning. And now in 2023, we have a new one. And the new one is to have climate change element in the comprehensive plan that deals with climate mitigation and climate resilience. So that is one of the reasons that the planning period got extended to 10 years, so that whatever we do now has to last and has to be good. So apropos of housing, in 2021, so let me just back up a minute. The legislature has been dealing with the issue of homelessness for a number of years. They've tried adding money to the Housing Trust Fund, which provides grant and low-income loans to nonprofits that build affordable housing. They have increased substantially the funding for what's called the Housing and Essential Needs Fund, which provides some financial relief to people who are at risk of losing their homes but might be saved from doing that if they had a payment for a car loan or a payment for a medical bill or something that could keep them from going under right on the spot. So they've done a lot of that kind of thing, but it isn't working. So in 2021, they said that local comprehensive governments have to take responsibility in their plans to accommodate housing and create affordable housing for all economic segments. So those of you who haven't been following the housing issue and the homelessness issue, may not recognize that in spite of some of the mythology about people who are on the street, they're not all drug addicts, they're not all other substance abusers, they're not all unemployed. A lot of the homeless people you do not see on the street. The majority of them are there because they cannot afford housing, and it's just plain and simple. So how do we provide housing affordable to the entire economic spectrum? That's the new charge in the comprehensive plans. So the first part is to do an inventory and an analysis of what we have right now. So Seattle has to figure out what do we have right now and what do we still need. And there's a prescription now that says that the planning has to include units for moderate, for market rate, moderate income, low income, very low income, severely low income, and emergency. So emergency shelter is new, and the rest of those, that specificity hasn't been there before. So there's another bill that was passed this year called House Bill 1110, and it basically says that because of the housing crisis and the fact that we're not likely to meet our affordability goals, innovative practices are necessary. So this bill is what they call the middle housing bill. This bill now says that no neighborhood can be zoned single family. Every neighborhood has to allow density at some degree. So you can no longer prohibit multi-units on a single family, what used to be a single family lot. So affordable housing is really defined as something that does not exceed 30% of the monthly income of the household who needs the housing. Now, this actually started from Housing and Urban Development, the federal government, and it's a standard that's used all across the country. And then it's adjusted according to household size. I'm skipping through some of the verbiage on here because you can get it later. It'll be available to you if you want to read it later, but I'm just trying to get the points across right now, and then we can come back and answer questions if you need it. So what has been added as a result of that middle housing bill is cottage housing, courtyard apartments, and what they call middle housing is all of the above, accessory dwelling units, and so forth, townhouses and stacked flats. These are examples of the kinds of housing that will be expected to now be permitted in places that now may have only one single-family dwelling. And it also took away some of the obligation to provide transportation and other utilities in the rural areas. So there's also that added incentive to keep the new development inside the urban areas where it's less expensive, more efficient, and can be done more easily. So there are a number of requirements, and I just put the one that affects Seattle in here. So any city in the Washington now with a population of over 75,000 has to allow at least 4 units per lot in all residential zoning, and at least 6 units per lot within 1/4 of a mile walking distance of a major transit stop. Now, just to be clear, in a minute I'll tell you what that is. It does not mean every bus stop. And then at least 6 units per lot if at least 2 of those are affordable. So if a developer comes along and says, well, I want to have 6 units in this new lot, but I'm not going to make any of them affordable, they're not necessarily permitted to do that. But if they come along and they say, I want to have 6 units and 3 of them or 2 of them will be affordable, and here's how I'm going to make it that way, that would be allowed under this new law. So a major transit stop is one that's on a high-capacity transit system. So what we have in this area, of course, is Sound Transit, commuter rail stops, fixed rail or guideway systems, or rapid transit routes. So we have in Seattle, I think, 5 or 6 different rapid transit routes. Most cities don't have any. Tacoma has been talking about developing one, and just a couple months ago said they aren't going to proceed with that after all. I don't remember why, but anyway. So most cities don't have that, but these are not regular bus stops. So a lot of the people who hear this think, oh my gosh, I'm living in a neighborhood my nice single-family neighborhood, and my neighbors are separated from me, and I love my house and my garden and everything. And now I'm going to have to do this because I'm near a bus stop. That isn't actually the case. So the intention is to have multifamily development as close to transit service as possible so more people can use the bus and will use the bus. More than 40% of the greenhouse gas emissions in the state, in Western Washington for sure, are from transportation sources. So the more people we can get into transit and out of cars, the better off they are. Additionally, the data recently says that it costs about $10,000 a year on average to own and operate a car. If you consider the car payments, the maintenance cost, the fuel cost, the insurance cost, and anytime you have something extraordinary that happens, the average cost per household or per car owner is $10,000 a year. Well, if those people are riding transit, they can save a lot of money. So the intention is to both support climate change, make it more efficient, and help people of low incomes save money by putting the housing density as close as possible to transit. So the state of Washington also asked Department of Commerce to come up with some numbers. So what does this mean in the state of Washington? So basically, when you break down those categories that I talked about, a total of 1.1 million new homes will be needed in the next 20 years. And when you look up the categories, about a third of them are in what we call the middle income and higher, 120% of average area median income. And then the others are distributed across permanent supportive housing, non-permanent supportive housing, and then the lower income area median income. So permanent supportive housing is the kind of housing that many of the chronically homeless will need. It's a type of housing where people are put into a residential unit and provided with wraparound services that can help them learn how to, if possible, or continue to live with that support, but learn how to live as independently as possible. It's intended for people who cannot live independently without that kind of help. It's very, very expensive because of that. So the intention is to get people going, get them on their feet, help them become independent, and then move on, but sometimes they can't. So at the 0 to 30% AMI, that is a very low income, and not all of them are assumed to need permanent supportive housing. And then as you go up the spectrum, the numbers get a little bit less. But those blue numbers in there, the blue boxes, that is the most critical, the hardest to get anybody to build, and it absolutely requires government subsidy to have it happen. And then you'll see also here, 91,000 emergency units are also necessary. So in King County, the Department of Commerce suggests this, that the total new housing needed by 2044 would be 337,000 units, of which permanent supportive housing would be approximately 43,000, and the low-income housing, not permanent supportive housing, would be almost 85,000, and so on up. So you can see that the lower-income housing need is quite large relative to the total. And then emergency shelter, they're estimating over 59,500 units are necessary to keep everybody housed in some form, or at least a roof over their head when they need it in the worst of the weather. So I looked at Seattle, and this is income information, just to put this in perspective, because we don't have a breakdown yet for how much each city in King County is expected to absorb. But just for perspective, the area median income in Seattle is $105,000. So when we're talking about under 30% AMI, we're talking about $31,500 a year. And if you look at that affordable rent standard, what 30% of that would be $790 a month. So if you move on up, you get to 80 to 100% AMI, and the people at that income level, which is at 105, is expected to be able to pay about $2,600 a month in rent, and so forth. Now, the average rent in Seattle is $2,260 a month. So when you're looking at $790 a month affordable and $1,317 and even $2,108, those are all below the average rent. And that's why we have homelessness. So we have to figure out what to do about that. Seattle housing data says that renters occupy about 50% of the housing, 55% of the housing units, and about 45% are owner-owned. One of the phenomena that's occurring across the country and including in Washington is that a lot of the single-family homes are now being bought up by corporations. It's one of the reasons why the rents are increasing. The other reason the rents are increasing is because there's just not enough housing. The vacancy rate is low. So landlords are going to charge what they can get. And so it leaves the people at the bottom out of the picture. So that's really what we're dealing with. And I don't think you can probably read the graph at the bottom, but 1% of the housing is available between $700 and $1,000 a month. Well, if we look at our $790 qualification here, 1% of the housing is not much, and so forth. So the biggest category, of course, is over $2,000 a month, and that is 57% of the housing in Seattle. So the rents are high, the incomes are low, and people are in trouble. That is what the comprehensive plan is supposed to tell us how to fix. That is what your input and other people's input needs to help with. So, went the wrong way here. So I broke it down by neighborhood just so you could kind of see where there are about more than twice as many on the list, and I just pulled out some ones that I thought people would recognize. And again, wanted to highlight $790 a month and $1,317 at below 50% area median income. You can't even get anything for $790, and the $1,317 can get you up to, well, it can't get you anywhere either. So you have to be 50% or more to get a rent in the average rental in any of these neighborhoods. And it just goes up. So why do we need public engagement? Well, number one, we need it because people don't really understand the issues. People really do not understand the issues. They don't understand what comprehensive planning is about. They don't understand why they should care. And they don't know enough about it to know what to say. So in order to get people more engaged, that is kind of what I'm taking this speaking role for, so that you have a sense of what's coming and why it's important. Another reason why the public needs to get engaged is because that public process adds creativity to the planning. If you put a bunch of planners together, they're all going to do the same thing. But my argument is that every neighborhood has a different kind of need. Every neighborhood has a different culture. They have a different kind of population that lives there. And if they were confronted with, you have to have increased density, we have to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions, how shall we do it in this neighborhood? Then you get a little more creativity than you will if the bureaucrats, and I used to be one, if we sit around and figure it out and then just tell people this is what we're going to do. The other piece is it creates a lot more thorough process. It basically holds everybody in government more accountable. And then finally, my conviction is that people will accept the outcomes a lot better if they've been part of that process. If they understand what's going on, they understand why it's happening, they understand what the options were and why they couldn't do some of the things they wanted, then you have a lot better acceptance in that scenario. So this is about the League of Women Voters, but I think it really applies to everybody. We don't typically have enough public engagement in planning. And I think there's a lot of fear, and that some people can stand out as leaders and help alleviate some of that fear. The fear is about, I don't know what's going to happen to me. I don't want my lifestyle degraded. I don't want to have to do some of this stuff. That is fear. But if they're engaged in the process and they realize what I'm going to say at the end, which is it's not going to happen tomorrow, then they can kind of participate in it, and it helps drop that fear level down and some of the antagonism. The League of Women Voters in particular, why are we talking about it? Our mission is defending democracy and empowering voters. This kind of information should be empowering for people in the community. We hope so. So we want to have people get more engaged in more inclusive processes. So I want to talk a little bit about what a typical plan might look like. So you probably, I don't know if you can read that, but a typical goal says, protect and enhance existing quality housing stock. My feeling is that isn't really going to help us get where we need to go. And shoot down, support access to quality and affordable housing for all residents. My question is how? How are you going to do that? That's one city that I picked out. Another one, and these are the most recent comp plans in these jurisdictions. Improve the overall quality of the city's housing. What does that tell you that the city is going to do? So the typical plan approach is the project gets initiated, and this is designed for a 2024 outcome. The public launch is in the fall, was maybe last fall. Draft documents come out this year, and then it goes through the legislative process in next year. Is that process, my question is that enough to get our housing needs met? And so here's a different kind of a process. So we have the countywide planning policies, an inventory, a projection, housing to employment relationship, how can we do that? Housing to services, what about stores? Conversation tonight was about how retail shopping is going away, but everybody needs groceries. Are we going to have everything delivered? So there has to be some kind of amenities in order for people to get what they need. And then how is the housing going to relate to the transportation? Then we have the density. So what kind of a mix is each neighborhood going to have? Where should it be added? Some neighborhoods can accommodate more than others. That it needs to be part of the conversation. Where can the utilities go and where can the shelters go? 59,000 more shelter beds in the next 10 years, 20 years actually, but even 5,000 more is going to take a lot of doing. And then for the neighborhood, what is the general look and feel you want to have? How are you going to deal with trees and open space? And what does the neighborhood need for it to be accepted? So that is a different kind of a process, and one that I think people should insist upon with their local planners. And the issue about trees also is important because there was a study that the University of Washington put out in June about urban heat in Seattle, and you read about it in the paper. So trees aren't going to be the only solution. So how are we going to develop in a way that the buildings actually don't add heat as much as they do now? We have to take that into consideration. So it is complicated, but ask the planners to work with you. And in this case, I think this area that you live in is not going to be affected much. Not nearly like some of the places up north or down south where there are a lot more single-family neighborhoods that haven't yet been touched. They haven't got the transit stops. They haven't got the sound transit stops. They haven't got a lot of the amenities. And you've got a lot of density here already, but some neighborhoods don't. So it's really not you as much as being informed about it and talking to other people. But the benefits to the planners are that they get to have some assistance with how they explain this, and the arrangements that get made. And the benefits to the community are that you get to have information in plain English. And again, the opportunity for creativity. So work with the planners to figure out where in the process the community engagement can be done most effectively. And don't say it can't. It has to happen. So one of the things that many neighborhoods will have to do is get some leadership who will become familiar with the details, the inventory, and talking about which neighborhoods are most marginalized. One of the things that the comprehensive plans also have to do is figure out how, when they're changing the nature of the neighborhood, they don't create gentrification that then requires that the lower income people have to move out. So that's part of the creativity. How do you increase the density, do it with quality, and make sure that the people who are there get to stay there? So I think I'm just going on and making the same point over and over, so I'll move on. So again, climate change and housing cannot be separated at this point in time. So the housing cannot be planned in isolation. And so how do we deal with tree canopies? How do we reduce automobile use, make more walkable neighborhoods, and provide more transit service? I'm just going to go on to say that this is an example of the current land use map in Seattle. And basically, the green areas are the city-owned park facilities, the larger ones. The blue areas are, I can't read it myself, the urban centers. And then what you have here is neighborhood residential areas are yellow. So you can see where there's going to have to be quite a bit of change. And then I pulled out what's going on, the Capitol Hill plan that exists now. And now this is not the one for 2024, which you will hear about in October. But this plan for this area says a neighborhood with distinct residential areas, active business districts, accessible transportation services, and strong institutions, which is diverse and densely populated. And it seems to me that you pretty much have that. Do you think so? Do you think so? Okay, so a lot of the stuff that is below that, you can read that when you get your copy of the PowerPoint, but that's a pretty good vision. Not every neighborhood has that. But Seattle has one of these plans with this kind of detail for every single neighborhood in the Seattle 2035 plan. But they have to update it now for the climate mitigation, climate resilience, and the housing density issues. So I'm not going to belabor that. So basically, because I've gone way past my 20 minutes, things that I'd like you to think about and ask your friends and your relatives and other acquaintances to think about is how will or should housing capacity be increased? How should or will housing affordability be developed? Now, we're going to need more money. The housing affordability issue is that without government subsidies, those people at the very bottom are never going to get housing. So what is it worth it to everybody to make sure that people have a roof over their head? What neighborhoods would be most affected or should? What else might those neighborhoods need to make the increased density more acceptable? How can urban heat effects be reduced in already densely populated areas like here? How should the current plan goals be updated? I put in this case for this neighborhood, but this is what every neighborhood should think about. And what can league members do, this is again for the League of Women Voters, to support the plan development? So just a reminder, this is not going to happen overnight. So the plan will be developed this year and into next year. At the end of 2024, it will be sent to the Department of Commerce for approval. The plan horizon is it'll be a plan for a 20-year period. The next update won't happen for 10 years, but there should be benchmarks in there for 3, 5, 7, 10, and so forth. So anytime there's redevelopment, it takes a really long time. The urban village concept in Seattle was started like 20 or 25 years before it actually got really developed. I heard somebody in Mercer Island, I think it was, saying that they had their transit-centered development. It took them 10 or 15 years to make something out of it. So the things that we plan now will take some time. And I'm saying that so that people are not scared. What they need to do is feel like they have a little bit control over it and help develop the plans that they can live with and that help other people get their needs met. So that is all I'm going to say. And thank you for listening.
Oh, thank you. I hope I didn't scare you by the 20 minutes because you maybe cut off some things. But I hope Cynthia's talk has raised some questions. And I know there are professional planners here and people with a lot of experience in housing and other fields. So please contribute your thoughts. Let's see. Susan has a microphone. Jean has a microphone. I see one hand over here. That looks like Bobby Spaeth. Yeah, okay.
Hi, I'm Barbara Spaeth. Nobody alive in this room knows, but the founding city planning director of Seattle was my late husband, John Duncan Spaeth. He was the planning director here for 30 years. And so I'm not even going to go into this because you were very optimistic and encouraging, but please correct the spelling. Your PowerPoint has misspelled the word capital. This is capital with an O, like the capital of the Capitol building, and you are rife with spelling mistakes. I'm no great speller because I was a broadcaster. I didn't have to worry except how to pronounce it. But you also, of course, it's difficult because there are many overlaying governmental forces of which Seattle has no control, all of which will impact everything in this planning process and could stymie everything. So you must think about this carefully, about the complexity of the transit services, but please fix the spelling, it's just driving me nuts. But remember that transportation and other forces will definitely control and have savaged Seattle in many ways. Now, the other thing you must remember is that we in the city of Seattle control the water supply for the region. And so growth depends on the utilities that serve not just Seattle, but all of suburbia. And so there's an interlocking force here at work where growth can happen and where growth cannot. And do we think about that when you do your interactions with the governmental agencies, that Seattle is the victim and also the victimizer, if you will, of the forces that will allow growth or not.
So I want to thank you for that, especially the spelling part. That was embarrassing, but thank you. But I also want to say, if we sit and think of ourselves as being powerless, we will be. So it is true there are dynamics out there. I mean, there are corporate interests. There are people competing over whether we have climate change or not. We have lots of debates about many issues. But if we consider that we have no input available to us, we won't. So I'm just trying to suggest that it's worth a little effort here. And this is probably not the best population to be saying that to, but you all have friends and relatives here, right? So anyway, I want to thank you. And yeah, your husband and you have a lot of experience I don't have. Thank you.
My name is Barbara Ray, and I have a naive question to ask. We have invited multi-wealthy companies and offered them some of our prime real estate. how involved can we invite some of the large businesses to become part of this city? I don't have a plan. I just feel that there is a gap between large companies, and it's all up to the mayor, the council, and the league. I feel that industry and big business should be part of contributing their strengths.
So I totally agree with that. I'm really glad you brought that up. So I happen to have been part of several different processes, including at Boeing Field Airport, where we ended up putting industry, corporations, and people together in the same room and talk through what we needed to do, why we needed to do it, and how could we all agree upon it. So I know it can be done. I think what has to happen is citizens of the city have to ask the elected officials and the planners to do that.
First of all, thank you very much. It was a wonderful sort of overview of what we're up against over the next few years. I just want everybody in the audience to know that on Monday, the 25th of September, you will have an opportunity to hear the two candidates who are going to represent this district on the city council. And I've been to a couple of, one in particular evening where they were part of a larger forum talking about what their priorities are. And I encourage you, as you think about this plan, to think about your priorities and what you expect from whoever is elected as, excuse my back, I'm sorry, to represent us on the council, to hear from you. And do come to the forum and hear what they have to say, because part of the questions that are being hatched for them from your input and from others is about their priorities for the system, including the whole issue of upzoning and infrastructure development, as well as the actual housing stock development. So do come.
Thank you.
If you don't have any more questions, it means I wasn't very clear. So something's wrong here.
I'm not hearing any reference to the idea of hold it up closer. Is that better? Mm-hmm. I'm not hearing any reference here to the idea of collective housing or shared housing. You're premising a single-family income here, but there's no sense of people coming together and sharing. I think that should be part of the model that we have.
Thank you for that. Shared housing is one of the most underappreciated, underunderstood, and underused options. So how many of you understand what shared housing is? Okay, awesome. So a lot of people, and including primary audience right now, is seniors still living in their homes, their original homes, and they have a lot of space, and maybe they have needs. They might have need for housekeeping services or yard work or something, or just companionship, or even money. So there are agencies that matchmake between people who need a place to live, a room, for example, and a person who has space. And in most communities, it is really underutilized, but I agree it is one of the best options that we could possibly have. Now, that doesn't address the state law requirements, which is going to be a much bigger deal, but to the extent shared housing services can be promoted, and it should be in the plan as a strategy, that would be great. Adele?
Do you have some examples of who are these? Do you have any examples of who are these matchmaking agencies?
I don't know in King County, but in Pierce County, there's an organization called Associated Ministries, and they just acquired another private nonprofit called Shared Housing Services. And Shared Housing Services was built on the model that I just described. So there has to be an option, maybe he knows, there has to be an option in King County that is comparable to that. But they do put people through a rigorous matchmaking process to make sure they don't put people together that are not compatible. They want to make sure that if somebody says they're going to pay $400 a month for a room, that they can do it and will do it and that kind of thing. They want to make sure that the person with the room is going to be respectful and so forth. So anyway, they do this massive matchmaking. Both parties sign a contract, and the contract also provides for mediation if there's a conflict, and they will provide the mediation. So it's a really, really great service. I don't know who does it in King County. There's one down here.
Question over here. Joan has one.
I think what Susan was talking about was things like co-housing, where groups of people join together and they realize that not every household needs an electric lawnmower or a washing machine, and that people can enjoy dining together as a community, like here, as well as having their own kitchens. Co-housing is an incredibly efficient way of housing people and making vital communities.
That's another wonderful example. Not in this presentation, but I actually have a spectrum of all these different options. So that is and that's one way to increase density efficiently and satisfactorily. So to the extent people can hear about that, that's one step up from cottage housing that I mentioned. So you could have shared co-op housing that is configured in any number of different ways, but they are sharing different kinds of parts of the facility, and yet each person has their own sleeping quarters. So,
what kind of involvement are young people brought into this plan? I'm thinking of high school students and civic teachers. This is their future, and they need to know what kind of world it's going to be if they don't take interest and become involved.
Don't know the extent to which that's happening, but you have a really good point. Really good point.
So, Susan? Oh, I guess we've got one more minute. Susan, Joan has.
I appreciate you showing us all of the other inputs that need to be considered in this comprehensive plan. And I can understand the pressure. The question I have is, how is the process going to change to be able to do that? More meetings, what?
That's what you have to talk to the planner about. Every community is doing it differently. Most communities that I've been talking to, their planners are not reaching out. They're not responding. So somehow the community needs to tell the elected officials and the planners they have to be involved. But I can't answer your question. That's what you can talk to the planner about next month.
What hasn't been mentioned is housing co-ops. I lived in one for 19 years on Capitol Hill, and that's where we own shares which in the building and grounds. It isn't real estate. And our board of 5 resident directors, we had no outside directors, interviewed every prospect and talked about what it's like to live in community. We explained the recycling, composting, and all that. And we made group decisions on renovation, so forth. And it was an affordable choice.
Great point.
Well, maybe we are running out of questions. I'm hoping that what we're getting tonight is at least we're getting awareness of what's happening with this comprehensive plan and this session that we're going to have with the city coming up. I really appreciate the background that Cynthia has given us. And my mic, I'm too close? Okay, well, thank you very much, Cynthia, and thanks everybody for coming. So hopefully this will get you started thinking.
Thank you very much.